The professor had already called on 2 humans before me, and both of them had failed in exactly the way he expected. I watched from the back row as Veth moved through the lecture theatre's upper arc on 4 of his 12 limbs, the others curled against his thorax in the resting configuration that, I'd learn later, signaled academic comfort. The room held 43 cadets from 9 species. I was the only auditor. My enrollment status was listed as observational or NON credit in the Academy's scheduling system, which meant I wasn't supposed to raise my hand, wasn't supposed to answer, and wasn't supposed to pass the comprehension benchmark even if I tried. Orwin had opened the session by explaining this benchmark in precise terms. He spoke the Academy's common tongue in a register that was technically correct and emotionally antiseptic, like reading a maintenance manual aloud. The xenolinguistic comprehension benchmark has been administered to 11 human auditors over 4 academic cycles, he said, projecting the record onto the lecture wall. 11 names. 11 scores. The highest was a 31 out of a possible 100. This is not a failure of effort. It is a structural limitation. Human cognitive architecture prioritizes sequential pattern resolution, what your species calls narrative. Xenosyntax does not use narrative. It uses recursive spatial embedding. These are not compatible processing modes. He said it the way you'd explain that a particular wrench doesn't fit a particular bolt. Normalis. Just taxonomy. Then he called on Cadet Faruan, a Sarvan third year seated in the front arc, and the lecture began. I had been on Earth doing geological survey work for most of my adult life, fault mapping, specifically. You spend enough years reading rock strata and you stop seeing layers and start seeing events. A fold isn't a shape, it's a record of pressure applied over time. A fault isn't a gap, it's the surface trace of a decision the Earth made under load. You learn to read the structure underneath the surface feature, because the surface feature is just the most recent consequence. Everything below it is the actual story. Orwin's first problem went up on the wall. A xenosyntax string in Kielvar, one of the 4 languages the course covered, a language built not on subject-verb-object but on what the Kielvar called relational weight, where words modified the relationship between other words rather than describing objects or actions directly. Faruan read it, provided the standard parsing, and Orwin corrected him in 2 places. Gently. Faruan's parsing had treated 2 of the weight markers as independent modifiers when they were in a nested relationship. I wrote one word in my field notebook, overburden. In geology, overburden is the material sitting on top of what you're actually looking at. Faruan was reading the overburden. The weight markers weren't independent because they were both responding to the same deeper relational pressure, a root structure that sat underneath both of them, the way a fault sits under the terrain features it created. Orwin moved to the next problem. He called on a Drevchi cadet named Osavil, 3rd year, caste rank 2nd in the room. The string was longer, a Verith construction this time. Verith syntax worked on what the course materials called temporal embedding. Meaning clauses didn't follow each other, they contain each other, like nested boxes. Osavil worked through it methodically and got the outer 2 layers right and the innermost layer wrong. I wrote, unconformity. An unconformity is a buried surface where 2 different geological periods meet. The rock above it was deposited under completely different conditions than the rock below, and the gap between them can represent millions of years that left no record. You can't read an unconformity by looking at either layer in isolation. You have to recognize that the relationship between the 2 layers is the data. Osavil had read both layers. She just didn't read the gap. This went on for 40 minutes. Orwin cycled through 9 cadets across 4 problem types. The errors were consistent in a way that I found interesting. Every cadet could parse the surface grammar correctly, and every cadet missed the structural relationship underneath it that governed how the surface grammar was supposed to behave. They were all reading the rock. None of them were reading the fault. I hadn't spoken once. I was an auditor. It wasn't my class. Orwin stopped at the front of the room. He had 1 problem left on his list. I could see the queue on the lecture wall, 9 completed, 1 remaining. He looked at the remaining students he hadn't called on yet, made some kind of assessment I couldn't read in his physiology, and then turned toward the back of the room. Toward me. The audit attendee, he said. Not unkindly. The way you'd address a piece of equipment you decided to test for data. You have been writing in that notebook since the 3rd problem. What have you written? I looked up from the notebook. The room had 43 cadets in it plus Orwin and me, and all of them had turned to look at the back row. Notes, I said. What kind of notes? I considered not answering. I was an auditor. I wasn't required to perform for him, but he'd asked a direct question and I'd been a field surveyor for 11 years, which meant I had a professional allergy to leaving a clear observational record unexplained. Geological analogues, I said. For the syntax structures. Each problem has a direct parallel in fault mechanics. Orwin was quiet for a moment. His secondary limbs did something I didn't have vocabulary for yet. The last problem, he said. He put it on the wall. You may attempt it. It was a compound Kielver-Verith construction, a crossover string, two syntax systems running simultaneously, each with their own weight markers and temporal embeddings, and the two systems were interacting with each other. The course materials I'd been given as an auditor noted that crossover constructions were the benchmark's final tier, and that no student below fourth year standing had ever parsed one correctly in real time. I read it once. The Kielvar weight markers were the overburden. The Verith temporal embeddings were the layers underneath. But the two systems weren't just running in parallel, they were in an unconformity relationship, meaning one system was older than the other in the structural sense, and the surface behavior of the Kielvar markers was being controlled by the Verith root underneath. You couldn't parse the Kielvar correctly without recognizing that the Verith structure was the actual foundation. It was exactly what you saw in a thrust fault. Older rock on top, younger rock underneath, because pressure had moved the older material over the younger. Surface age and structural age running in opposite directions. You couldn't read it by looking at the surface. You had to read the direction of the force. The Kielvar weight markers are secondary, I said. They look like the main structure, but they're overriding material. Older syntax system sitting on top of a younger Verith root that's doing the actual load-bearing work. The temporal embedding in the Verith section is the foundation layer. You parse the Verith root first, then read the Kielvar markers as surface expressions of the relational pressure the Verith embedding is generating. I paused. The meaning of the string is, the obligation does not precede the relationship. The relationship is what creates the obligation. The weight markers are modifying the obligation term, but they're taking their instruction from the Verith root, which defines the relationship first. The lecture theatre was quiet. Orwin had not moved from the front of the room. He looked at the string on the wall. He looked at me. Then he took down the problem queue and put up a single line of Academy administrative text instead, a file modification form, the kind used to change a student's enrollment classification. He filled in my name. He filled in the course number. He changed observational or NON credit to enrolled as standard. Then he turned back to the room and continued the lecture without calling on anyone else. His voice was the same, precise, antiseptic, correct. But he didn't look at the back row again, and he didn't explain what he'd just done. He didn't need to. 43 cadets had watched him do it. I wrote one more line in my notebook before I closed it. Read the fault, not the terrain. That was the only note that mattered, and I'd already known it before I walked in.